Those first sales are kind of like fool's gold, where you see these big numbers and it looks like there's this giant premium available, but that price doesn't exist for very long. If you're grading cards for profit, you're probably putting a whole bunch of time into figuring out which cards do you actually submit for grading. Now, the thing that a lot of people in this market overlook is when to grade those cards. And in this video, I'm going to walk you through exactly how I use market timing to help make sure I'm avoiding mistakes and also putting myself in the best possible position to maximize my grading results. Now, if you're new here, I'm Ryan Seaver. I'm a longtime card investor. I've graded thousands of cards, and I always thought the learning curve in the card market sucked. And so I run a program and I make content like this to help people that are trying to get on their feet in this market, hopefully go a little bit faster and skip some of the mistakes that I had to learn the hard way. All right, let's dive in. So before we get to the timing piece, let's talk real briefly on overall grading strategy. So the two things that I'm looking at when picking a card to grade are value and condition. And so for value, the thing that I want to know is there enough value added by this grade to justify spending the time and the money on getting that card graded? And so for me, I deal in a lot of ultra modern cards, so I'm looking for PSA 10s. There's really no other grade that I'm looking for. And so what I do is I look at the raw price of the card and I compare that to the PSA 10 price and I say, okay, is there enough margin here for me to make a meaningful profit after all my fees? Now, how do we decide how much is enough? Well, I created a rule I call the 2x rule, and this is where I'm looking for cards where the PSA 10 value is 2x the amount of the raw price plus the grading fee. So double your total cost. And so effectively what the 2x rule does is it helps us stay focused on cards where we're going to win big if we actually get the grade that we're looking for. And so I don't want to send off a card where I'm only getting $32 out of a PSA 10 after spending money on the raw card and spending, 20 some odd dollars on the grading fee itself. There's hardly any meat on the bone left. What I want is big PSA 10 upside. I want to win big when I get the grade I'm looking for. Don't you? Like, it takes the same amount of time, the same amount of effort to find these cards, to send them off for grading. You might as well actually win big and get some money on the back end. And targeting higher upside cards is one of the biggest unlocks in this market because you can just go so much faster. You can be doing the exact same amount of work as someone else who's sending lower upside cards, and you're going to go way faster than them, even if you're objectively worse as a grader, because you can get a lower gem rate and still come out way further ahead just based on how much upside is attached to those PSA 10 grades. Okay, so that's value. Now, if the value's not there, there's no reason to even care about condition, but let's assume that we found a card where we do like the value, we do like the upside. Now we turn our attention to condition and we ask the simple question of, okay, is this card clean enough to at least have a chance to get the grade that we need to add all that value that we just identified? And we have to understand there are human beings grading cards, so there's variance in the grading process. That's okay, that's just part of it. And so we're not going to be able to know for certain, but the more reps you get in this space, the better you'll get at identifying what is PSA actually looking for, what cards can get a 10. And I just want to make sure that as long as there's big upside, I'm sending a card that has a strong chance to get the grade that I'm looking for. So we check the box on value, we check the box on condition, good to go, right? Well, not quite, because this is where timing comes into play. And sometimes even if we send a card that looks like a good play, but we send it at the wrong time, we're setting ourselves up for a much smaller win or even a loss compared to what it might look like today. And so we'll get into some of the specifics here shortly, but the overarching concept here is that we are making a bet on where the cards market will be when we get that card back from grading. It's not about where it is today. It's about where that card's market will be in the future. And so there's quite a few things that can affect this, but let's talk about a few of the major ones. So the first is seasonal timing and understanding where we are in the calendar year and how that impacts the value of sports cards. So the simplest way to think about seasonal timing is that as we start to exit the season, values tend to soften because teams are eliminated from the playoffs, attention starts to move elsewhere, people kind of get just tired of the season and there's something new just around the corner. If you're at the end of the baseball season, well, football's just around the corner, basketball's just around the corner. And so people start to turn their attention elsewhere. And that can impact values very quickly, even of good cards of good players. And then values tend to rise on the way back into the following season. So when we're looking at all of the attention coming back into the market, kind of follows that values would pick up around that time, right? And so that's when you see all the maximum hype for all the players. There's so much possibility with the new season and everyone could be the MVP. So, just a whole lot of attention on that sport going into the following season. So what does this mean for grading? Well, let me give you a couple examples. So if we're buying cards at the absolute peak of baseball hype going into the season, it's spring training and we're looking at a young prospect that's, maybe they've got a chance to make the team out of spring training, peak hype, we're at all-time high prices for this player, and you're buying a bunch of these cards and then you send them off for grading. Well, you're not going to see those cards for 2, 3, 4 months. How is that player's performance going to hold up? I hope he plays well enough that his cards don't fall in value during that time. Same thing for football. If we're buying one of the hot rookies from last year's rookie class and they're going into year 2, they've got all the hype before the season. This is the time when values tend to peak for football. So if we're talking about July, August timeframe, and we're buying these cards and then we're sending them off for grading, guys, the season might be a quarter or half of the way over by the time you get that order back. And so again, I ask the question, how is this player's performance going to hold up? Is he going to play well enough for his values to hold? And so when I'm looking at seasonal timing, the main filter I'm using is, do I have to actually rely on this player to play a certain kind of way for his values to hold during the time that my cards are being graded? If so, I probably don't want to go after that play unless the upside on that play is so enormous that it's going to offset any underperformance, any injury, anything that can happen to hurt the values. That would be a time when I might consider one of those plays anyway. But for the most part, the cards that I'm grading, I just don't want to take that risk. And so I like to focus on buying the prospects, the up and coming rising star caliber guys, those guys that are just less proven. I want to do that earlier where I know I'm going to have those cards back before the season starts. And that way I can lock in the profits before I need to rely on their performance for any reason. Now, once we're into the season, or if I'm sending an order right before the season where I know for a fact I'm not going to have those cards back in time to sell before the season starts, that's where I start to go toward the more established players where you don't have to worry about is their performance going to tank because their markets are so established. If you go buy a Steph Curry card, a LeBron card, Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, Aaron Judge, Shohei Ohtani, like some of these guys that are just the best of the best in their sport, they're always in demand. Yeah, values may fluctuate a little bit based on performance, but for the most part, that those guys are going to have a market regardless of how they start the season. And so that's where there's not nearly as much risk. You can also get into guys that are retired. They're still making cards of Hall of Famers. So you can go and look at a Ken Griffey Jr. card or a Tom Brady or one of these guys that just their market isn't going anywhere anytime soon. And so to me, those are safer grading plays just because they've got such established markets. All right, let's walk through an example of this together. So let's say it's November and we're looking at what cards do we target for grading? Well, I know that what's in season right now might not be the thing that's popular by the time I get my cards back. So at that time of year, what I'd be looking at is actually baseball cards. Even though it's out of season, by the time we get the cards back 2, 3, 4 months later, depending on the turnaround times and everything, we're going to be looking at getting those back right before the season starts. And that's usually a really nice time for baseball cards. And so you can jump into your favorite comp tool and look up values one at a time and try to figure out which cards have some good upside. If you want a shortcut for this, I've built a software tool called the Card Opportunity and Investing Navigator. It looks like this. We call it COIN for short. But what this tool does is it shows you all of the cards with big time upside. This updates a couple of times a day, so you're always working with fresh data. But this is basically the shortcut, so you can do 5 hours of research in 5 seconds. And so I'm not interested in hockey. I don't want football. There's a couple baseball here, but let's just go to the baseball list and simplify this. And let's just say, actually, I know I want to target some Paul Skeens stuff here. So let's say that I really like Skeens upside and I want to target cards that have a higher gem rate. So I'm going to add this. Now, gem rate is the number of PSA 10s divided by the total number of cards graded. And so I'm looking for cards that have higher gem rates because usually that tells me that the set was pretty cleanly manufactured. And oftentimes that gives us a way to kind of find some cards that have a better chance of being in clean, raw condition. So let's say I like Topps Chrome update. So let's go with this X-Fractor here. And I can just see, okay, raw price $25. The average for PSA 10s over the past month or so is about $130. And I know that going into the season, I may have a chance to actually pick up a little bit of extra juice on top of that if he gets some preseason momentum. That sounds like a play that we could win on if we find some clean raw copies of that card. So then going back into the tool here, all I do is once I've identified a card that I like, I click the link and it's going to take me straight to eBay where I can find some copies of that card and figure out, all right, are these clean enough to go after for for grading purposes, and that is the entire process. And by the way, if you're someone who grades regularly and you think you'd get value from coin, you can actually try this tool for free. I'll leave a link in the description where you can grab a free 7-day trial and see what you think. Okay, to summarize timing, so we want to make sure that we're targeting cards where they're not going to be at risk of dropping a bunch in value while they're out for grading. And it's not that we can only grade a sport for a couple of months of the year. It doesn't work that way. You can grade all sports all year long if you like. It's up to you. But what I like to do is just make sure I'm kind of skewing my unproven players to make sure I get those back before the season. And then once we're getting to the orders that are going to come back during the season, that's where I'll start to skew toward the more proven names. So the second thing that we want to consider is turnaround time. And we know that we have options here, right? So if we look at PSA's website, there's a bunch of different options based on the value of the card, based on how much you're willing to pay for the grading fee. And so we got to look at this and consider, okay, do we always just want to go with the cheapest option? Or is it possible that there's a time where we should pay up for the faster turnaround? And so the way I look at this, in a perfect world, the value of my cards would not change at all while they're out for grading. Yes, I understand things can go up, but they can also go down. And if I've done the right research on the front end to identify a card that has tons of upside as a PSA 10, that's all I'm looking for. I don't need extra on top of that. I'm just trying to capture that exact opportunity. So the faster I can get my card back and turn that thing around and lock in that price, the happier I'm going to be and the more consistent I can be. Now, the thing that comes into play here is the longer those cards are sitting there at PSA being graded, the more risk we're introducing. Time passes, things can happen, right? Player can get hurt, player can underperform. Someone that looks really good going into the season can start the season 0 for 100 with 100 strikeouts. Who knows? And values can tank really quickly. And so what we're trying to do is get our cards back as quickly as we're able to without paying so much in the grading fees that it's taking a giant bite out of the profits. So you kind of have to find the right balance there between time and money. But if we get back in here into PSA's grading turnarounds, and just like a lot of people are going to be looking at this bulk price, for example, and say, all right, let's pay $22. It's the cheapest price for a sports card. We can get this thing back in 95 business days. That is almost 5 months, guys. That's a lot of uncertainty during that time. And what happens if we just paid an extra $6 to get into this value submission and get it down to 75 business days instead of 95? That's a full calendar month faster for just $6. And so I don't like paying higher grading fees either, but sometimes you got to weigh out the value of the time and the money and say, okay, is $6 worth getting this card back a full month sooner? The faster you get your orders back, the more money you end up making across the year because you're able to reinvest that money. And again, this is assuming that you're picking the right cards and everything. There's no guarantees here, but sometimes it is worth paying up to get that faster turnaround. So what I'm looking for here is cards that have big enough upside that can more than absorb the extra $6 or even the extra $20 or so to get into that next tier up, because it's going to mean that I can get that order back just that much faster, keep my money moving, get to the next order, and keep things rolling. So cheap is great. Everyone likes to save money, but just keep in mind that cheap is not always the best option for your card. All right, the next one is a huge one, and a lot of people miss this, and it costs them a bunch of money. So please pay attention to this one. But when we look at new products, we have to understand that there is going to be a major wave of grading that happens shortly after that product is released. And so everyone wants to go after the new products, of course, because that's where all the rookies are. And so if you look at, Prism from the Panini era, or a Topps Chrome release, or, Bowman Chrome, or one of these releases that's going to have a bunch of cards people are going to want to target for grading, this is where you must proceed with caution. So there is a pattern that happens over and over and over again in this market. And you can see it very clearly. I'm going to show you some data in just a second here, but the first copies of a big name player's rookie card, and especially the first PSA 10 graded copies, almost always they go for way higher than they ever should. And then they very quickly fall off of a cliff. It's like there's 2 or 3 people out there that are just racing to get the first copy of a card that's not rare. And they just bid each other up endlessly. And someone ends up paying $1,200 for a card that's going to be worth $65 in a couple of months. It's crazy, but it happens over and over and over again in this market. But this is a pattern we have to be aware of as graders, because those first sales look really appealing. It's just that you can't always get that price that first copy and even the second and third and fourth copies go for when you're the 30th or the 300th or the 3,000th copy of that card as a PSA 10 to hit the market. And so those first sales are kind of like fool's gold where you see these big numbers and it looks like there's this giant premium available. If you get this card graded, you can pay $40 for the card and sell it for $1,200. Yes, that looks great, but that price doesn't exist for very long. So if you're not one of the first couple of copies to market, you're not going to see anywhere close to that price typically. But don't take my word for it. Let's look at some actual data here. So we're going to go to the Victor Wembanyama Prism 136, so his 2023 rookie card. And this is as a PSA 10. You can see the sales history here. And they started off super strong. So the couple of copies up here around 500, few in the 400 range. And then very quickly they fall off of a cliff. And you know why? It's because many thousands of copies of this card were graded during these first few months. They all hit the market at the same time. So basic supply and demand here. If we see demand stay about the same and the supply continues to climb rapidly, well, that puts downward pressure on prices. And that's exactly what we see with this curve here. And so they stay pretty level for a long time. Now, there was still a good grading opportunity here for a while because you could buy this card for about $20 ungraded, get it graded, and then flip it for around 100, 125 for a while. There were like 3 or 4 months where that was a very viable play. It's just that we're not going to get that $500 price. So you got to be aware of this. And the problem is for Wembanyama, one of the biggest basketball prospects in recent memory, that's going to be a card that even if there are 25,000 PSA 10s on the market, like there are right now, there's still going to be enough demand to support high values for that card. But if you get into a player from that second or third tier down where they're good, but they don't have that level of market depth, that's where you're going to see these big prices for the first couple of copies where they might sell for $200, but then very quickly that card falls off and it's worth $40 as a PSA 10. And so unlike the Wembanyama example where there was a solid grading play even after they kind of fell down a bit, there is not a solid grading play if your card ends up in the $40 range as a 10. So that's the risk and that's what we've got to be careful of. So that's Wembanyama. Let's go to another example here. So CJ Stroud, and say what you want about his more recent performance, but he was the big name guy for the Prism set in 2023 football. So same exact pattern, right? If we look back at the Wembanyama pattern, look at this pattern. And then you see it again here for CJ Stroud, where you see a big sale up here, a couple others that are down here, and then very quickly more and more copies hit the market, and they just flatten out really quickly. And this card is popped 7,800. So there are plenty of copies hitting the market during this window right here, and that's what puts the downward pressure on prices. Another example here, Jaden Daniels, Prism number 347. As a PSA 10, he was the big name from the 2024 set. You see this massive, massive sale up here, couple more that are in the 800 plus range. And then very quickly, this card settles. Still a solid grading play for a while there, similar to the Wembanyama, where these were over $100 for a few months. But very quickly, they taper off, and this isn't nearly as appealing of an opportunity as when they first came out. And so you see this card is pop 5,000 here. That's the reason why the value doesn't hold up, because there are so many copies. And again, they are all hitting the market in this first, 6 to 9 months after the product is released. There's a bunch of people opening product, cards hit eBay, people buy those cards, they send them to PSA, and then a few months down the road, they get those back. And then all of these cards are hitting the market at the same time. So you're seeing literally hundreds or thousands of listings at a time. That is so many cards for the market to be able to support the same price without the value starting to fall. And that's what you see happening here. All right, one more example here. So let's go to the Cooper Flag Topps rookie card number 201. So this is, at the time of this recording, a relatively new card, but we're already seeing this same exact pattern. So $1,000 sale, 700, 500, 500, 400, 400, 400, 300. They're already falling off as more copies are hitting the market here. And so you're going to see this exact same pattern happen with that card as well. I would bet a lot of money that it's going to be the exact same pattern where you see that kind of inverse hockey stick where it starts off hot and then they quickly taper off. And that's the thing that we want to make sure that we're aware of. It doesn't necessarily mean that this can't be a good grading opportunity. It absolutely could be. But the question is, what will happen to his values when more of these cards hit the market? If there are going to be hundreds or thousands of copies all hitting eBay, that's where it's really hard for those $400 values to hold. And we're just going to see this card drop off more and more, if you ask me. And so it's important to note that this is for base cards. If you get into the rarer stuff, you don't always see that same pattern. And that's one of the big reasons why I like targeting rarity whenever possible. There's going to be just bigger margin in general on a lot of those cards, but also you don't have to worry about thousands of copies hitting the market all at the same time. You're not competing with that many different cards, and so you have a little bit more influence over the price that it sells for. So the warning here is just be careful when you're looking at values on a brand new product. Something that just came out might start off looking really strong as a grading opportunity, but then once more copies actually hit the market, the opportunity ends up not being nearly as strong. And if your cards are still sitting at PSA while the values are dropping, you're not going to feel nearly as good about your order by the time you get those things back. So what do we do instead? Do we just skip those plays? Well, again, I'm looking at rarity as one of the easiest ways to kind of mitigate some of this risk, because you have way more control over the value if you have one of the few copies rather than one of the hundreds or thousands of copies on the market all at once. Another thing I'll do is look at cards from older sets that have had at least 6 to 12 months to kind of settle and go through that trajectory. And once that happens, if the values are still strong, that's when I'll look at that and I'll say, okay, this is kind of leveled off. It has settled. It has gone through this first year grading wave, and now it's a much more stable card. And so if we go back to that Victor Wembanyama card, you can see now that this card is actually up a good bit, and it's back into the $150, $125 range over the past couple of months here. And so that to me is a card that all of a sudden I'm kind of interested in that one again, because you can still get them relatively cheap ungraded. There's over $100 of margin if you look at the actual play, at least at the time of this recording. This can always change. But that's a type of card that all of a sudden I don't have to worry about 25,000 copies hitting the market anymore, because that already happened. And so the market has already adjusted to those 25,000 copies. And now we can proceed knowing that this is kind of the new baseline for this card. Now, the last piece to the puzzle is looking at, do we send cards to a different grading company to try to get a faster or a cheaper turnaround? And the way I look at this is the reason why I'm grading cards is because I want to add as much value and as much liquidity as possible. PSA does a great job at adding value and liquidity. Now, the problem with this logic is when we look at some of these other companies, the liquidity just isn't there, and neither is the value. So we can end up doing a whole bunch of work and really just not get the payoff at the end of the day. And so ultimately what that means is we end up having to send 2, 3, 4 different submissions to try to profit the same amount that we would profit from one good PSA submission. So to me, that's not an option right now. I'd love to see the market for grading get a little bit more competitive again. It used to be that BGS was a much bigger player, and that's actually where I used to send all my stuff, because it was all about the value, and BGS added the most value to ultra modern cards back then. But since then, PSA has pulled away. This is over the past decade or so. It's not a competition anymore. PSA has a chokehold on the grading market right now. Could that change in the future? Absolutely. But what I'm doing is looking at the turnaround and saying, I can't control the turnaround time, but I can control what I submit, and I can do a better job planning my orders to make sure that I'm setting myself up for success. So guys, I hope this helps. And at the end of the day, the card selection matters a ton, but when you can also layer in this timing piece and understand when we're sending cards matters just as much as what we're sending, that's when you can really amplify your results with the grading game. And by the way, if you like this stuff and you want to go even deeper with card strategy and get personalized guidance along the way, I run a program called Ignite where we do exactly that. We've got over 100 card investors learning, leveling up, and winning together. It's so much fun. We'd love to see you in there. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to see full details, but otherwise, we'll see you on the next video.